Don't talk politics, please. It's just rock and roll. I mean, I hate politics.
Alice Cooper wasn't just a rock star. He was an embodiment of rock and roll itself. He lived it, breathed it, and guarded it with the ferocity of a man protecting his soul. For him, rock wasn't a platform for lectures or politics. It was a world of sound, rebellion, and art, a place where people came to escape the chaos, not drown deeper in it. So when politics or ego crept into that sacred space, it lit a fire in him that few could calm. Even now, at 77, Cooper has no hesitation admitting there were a few names in rock that really got under his skin. Artists who poked at his values, crossed creative lines, or simply tested his patience one too many times. Dee Snider. The first name that appeared on Alice Cooper's list was Dee Snider. Both men stood proudly on the wild theatrical edge of rock music. They were showmen who knew how to grab attention, with makeup, stage chaos, and pure attitude that left fans speechless. They had built careers on the shock factor, on taking the stage and making audiences question what they had just witnessed. But while they shared a love for spectacle and rebellion, their beliefs about what rock music should represent could not have been more different. For Dee Snider, rock was more than entertainment. It was a weapon, a tool to challenge systems, spark conversation, and take a stand against authority. Snider saw music as a way to push for real-world change. He believed that artists had a duty to speak up for freedom and justice, especially when others were silent. Alice Cooper, however, had a very different philosophy. He viewed rock as a release, a way to escape the noise of politics and the tension of society. To Cooper, rock and roll was about freedom in its purest form, but that freedom meant not forcing opinions or political messages on anyone. He wanted his concerts to be a break from reality, not an extension of it. Cooper often said that telling fans how to think, act, or vote would betray everything rock stood for. In his mind, true freedom meant letting people make up their own minds. But Snider couldn't agree with that. He was the kind of artist who was willing to walk into Congress and testify for free speech, risking his image to defend the right of artists to offend or provoke. He wanted to use his fame for impact, even if it came with consequences. When Cooper's past comments about staying away from politics resurfaced in 2018, Snider didn't hold back. He publicly expressed his disappointment, calling Cooper's stance cowardly and saying that real artists should never stay silent when they have a voice powerful enough to influence millions. He even reminded people that Cooper once told him he would not have testified at those famous Senate hearings, a statement that struck a nerve. Cooper was furious. To him, Snider had crossed a line from disagreement to personal attack. He felt that Snider had twisted his words and questioned his integrity. For a man who prided himself on honesty and authenticity, that was unforgivable. What started as a difference in ideals between two legends of rock had now turned into something deeper, a clash of values that ended a long mutual respect. Dennis Dunaway. Then there was Dennis Dunaway, a name that cut much deeper. Unlike Snider, Dennis wasn't an outsider or a rival. He was family. They had grown up together, built a band from the ground up, and dreamed of shocking the world back in high school. Cooper wasn't even Alice yet. He was still Vince Fournier, the class clown who loved art as much as he loved mischief. He and Dennis bonded over surrealist artists like Salvador Dali, long before fame or chaos ever entered the picture. Their first taste of the stage was Innocent, a parody Beatles act at a school talent show. But what started as teenage fun became the foundation of a band that would redefine theatrical rock. Together with Michael Bruce, Neil Smith, and Glenn Buxton, they became the Alice Cooper Group, a force of raw energy, weirdness, and rebellion. But like so many great bands, success didn't bring peace. It brought tension, exhaustion, and ego. They were young, famous, and burning out fast. By the time they recorded Muscle of Love in 1973, things were falling apart. The trouble started when producer Bob Ezrin began steering the creative direction Cooper didn't mind. He trusted Ezrin's instincts. But for Dennis, it felt like the soul of the band was being hijacked. What looked like a small creative disagreement quickly turned into a full-blown rift. Cooper, already overwhelmed by fame and fatigue, turned to alcohol. And in that haze, every disagreement felt like betrayal. The brotherhood that once held them together was corroding in real time. Eventually, the band members drifted apart. Dennis and a few others formed Billion Dollar Babies, hoping to capture that old magic again, but it fizzled out after just one album. Years later, they would reunite, perform again, even laugh together. But Cooper never forgot how bitter that split had felt. The love was real, but for a time, so was the hate. Frank Zappa. Then there was Frank Zappa, the genius who had once seemed like a mentor, but ended up feeling more like a nemesis. In the late 60s, Zappa was running 2 record labels, Straight Records and Bizarre Records, and he was on the hunt for something different, something wild. He found it one night at a party in Los Angeles. When Alice Cooper's band took the stage, most of the crowd left. Their sound was too raw, too bizarre, too ahead of its time. But Zappa didn't walk out, he leaned in. He loved the chaos, the risk, the edge, and that night, he signed them. For a while, it seemed like the perfect partnership. Zappa was the eccentric genius, Cooper, the daring young rebel. But that relationship soured fast. When Cooper recorded his first album, Pretty's For You, Zappa practically left him to figure it out on his own, handing production duties to others. When the band finally found their true sound, darker, sharper, more defined, Zappa gave them just 7 days to record the whole thing. 7 days to make an album that would define their careers. It wasn't guidance, it was sabotage. The final blow came later when Cooper's team went to court with Zappa's over royalties. The outcome was brutal. Cooper lost millions and the rights to all his early work. Everything recorded before Billion Dollar Babies was gone. Cooper had been burned, but he knew better than to speak out. Zappa was powerful, respected, and dangerous to cross publicly. So he bit his tongue, smiled through interviews, and buried his bitterness deep. But make no mistake, it was there. Kasabian. Then came Kasabian, a band far younger than Cooper, but just as loud when fueled by alcohol and ego. In 2007, both acts were performing at a rock festival in Bucharest, Romania. Kasabian was the up-and-coming indie electronic fusion band from Leicester, England. Brash, confident, and already making waves, Cooper, of course, was the legend on the bill, the elder statesman of shock rock. What should have been a night of mutual respect turned into one of the few times Alice Cooper ever got into a physical altercation. The trouble started over, once again, politics and whiskey. The Kasabian guys were reportedly drunk and mouthing off about Americans and the Iraq War. They joked that the US was to blame for dragging the world into chaos. Cooper, who had heard enough, snapped. He told them to drop it. "Don't talk politics," he said. "It's just rock and roll." But Kasabian didn't back off. They pushed harder, literally. One of them shoved Cooper's bass player, and that was it. Cooper jumped in. Chaos followed, chairs scraped, voices rose, and fists almost flew before onlookers pulled everyone apart. It could have ended much worse, but no one got seriously hurt, which was probably the only reason it didn't turn into a lawsuit. Later, Cooper brushed it off in interviews. He said it was just alcohol and tempers mixing badly, that nobody meant real harm. But for a while, he couldn't help but resent them. Not because of the fight itself, but because it symbolized everything he hated. Politics and ego, once again, had found their way into a place he believed should be sacred, the music. And to Cooper, that was unforgivable. Still, in time, he let it go. He even admitted Kasabian were a good band, talented and bold, but deep down, the night remained a reminder. When politics enters rock and roll, somebody always ends up bleeding, if not on the outside, then somewhere inside. John Lennon. John Lennon was not the kind of man who went unnoticed in any room, and when his path crossed with Alice Cooper's, sparks of brilliance and chaos were bound to fly. Both men ruled the unpredictable world of 60s and 70s rock, but they came from completely different corners of it. Lennon had just escaped the Beatles' golden cage and reinvented himself as a revolutionary voice, never afraid to challenge power or preach peace. Cooper, on the other hand, had carved his name through shock, stage blood, and theatrical madness. One played the philosopher of rebellion, the other, the ringmaster of chaos. When they collided, the result wasn't rivalry, it was a strange kind of brotherhood built on music, alcohol, and mischief. Their first encounter was during the Toronto Rock and Roll Revival in 1969. Lennon showed up unannounced with his Plastic Ono band, still buzzing from the breakup of the Beatles. Cooper's group had also been on the lineup, delivering a performance that was loud, bizarre, and unforgettable. But their friendship didn't really begin on stage. It began in bars. Cooper's Hollywood Vampires Club was a safe haven for rock legends who loved their liquor as much as their lyrics, and Lennon was a frequent visitor whenever he was in Los Angeles. Along with Ringo Starr and Harry Nilsson, they'd drink until morning, trading jokes, insults, and confessions. Cooper often found himself the unwilling referee as Lennon and Nilsson's debates spiraled into wild arguments over politics, morality, and everything in between. He recalled that after a few drinks, the two would argue about absolutely anything. If Lennon said something was black, Nielsen would insist it was white. If one supported the Democrats, the other would loudly defend the Republicans. Cooper sat between them, trying to keep the peace, but it was a losing battle. The more they drank, the louder the laughter and the arguments became. Yet beneath all that chaos, Lennon pushed Cooper in ways that no one else did. He constantly urged him to use his platform for something bigger than entertainment, to speak about change, to take a stand. Cooper refused every time. "John, you're trying to save the world," he told him once. "I'm just trying to entertain it." That simple sentence defined the difference between them. Lennon wanted to inspire revolutions. Cooper just wanted to make people forget their troubles for a while. Still, there was no hate between them, only mutual respect tangled with frustration. Blackie Lawless. Moving down the list comes Blackie Lawless, a man who walks straight out of Alice Cooper's nightmares, or perhaps his reflection. Lawless, frontman of the band WASP, was a product of Cooper's influence. He grew up watching Alice perform with his snakes and guillotines, and he was mesmerized. He once called seeing Cooper live a religious experience. He studied the art of shock rock like scripture, and when he finally built his own band, the DNA of Alice Cooper's theatrics ran through everything he did. But what began as admiration slowly curdled into resentment. As WASP gained attention, comparisons to Cooper became impossible to ignore. Interviews began to pit them against each other, and soon Cooper was calling Lawless unoriginal. He said that what Lawless was doing was just a copy of what he had already done in the 70s. Same lines, same routines, same shock factor. For Alice, originality was sacred, and seeing someone else borrow his blueprint without acknowledgement irritated him. Lawless didn't stay silent. He clapped back, accusing Cooper of hypocrisy. He said that when Cooper left his original band to pursue solo work, he didn't give his own former bandmates enough credit either. The tension simmered for years as both men danced around each other in interviews, one claiming to be the true originator, the other arguing that shock rock belonged to everyone. Yet deep down, there was a strange respect buried beneath their rivalry. Both of them had pushed rock beyond its limits. Both had terrified parents, thrilled teenagers, and made the genre impossible to ignore. Cooper once said that he still loved competition in music because it kept him sharp. When he went on stage, he wanted the crowd to forget anyone who came before him, and maybe that's exactly why he couldn't stand Blackie Lawless, because the young rocker reminded him that every legend eventually becomes someone else's blueprint. Marilyn Manson. Then came Marilyn Manson, a figure who seemed born from Cooper's own shadow. Manson took everything Alice had done and cranked it to a new, darker level. Where Cooper used horror and theater to entertain, Manson used it to disturb and provoke. His performances were sermons of blasphemy, drenched in religious imagery and violence. He sang about the church, the government, and the media, turning rebellion into a religion of its own. Cooper watched all of this from a distance, half proud, half uneasy. He recognized the creativity and intelligence behind Manson's act, but he couldn't connect with its purpose. For Cooper, rock was an art form and a show, but Manson had turned it into a weapon. Their philosophies couldn't have been more different. Cooper had found faith again after years of addiction and self-destruction. He saw Christianity not as a tool for control, but as a way to rebuild himself. Manson used the same symbols Cooper now respected to shock and provoke. That contrast was almost poetic. Two generations of shock rockers divided by what they believed in. When Manson faced allegations later in his career, journalists ran straight to Cooper for comment, but instead of choosing sides, he took the most human approach. He said that in his experience, Manson had always been polite and professional. He added that allegations are allegations and truth takes time. It wasn't a defense or an attack, it was caution born from decades of experience in the ruthless world of fame. Cooper made it clear that he didn't share Manson's beliefs or aesthetic, but he also refused to become part of a public witch hunt. There was no love between them, but there wasn't blind hate either. Just the weariness of one artist looking at another and realizing they'd walked similar roads, only in opposite directions. Gene Simmons. Finally, at the very top of Cooper's most disliked list stood Gene Simmons, the fire-breathing businessman behind Kiss. Gene wasn't just a rock star, he was an empire. He sold image, sound, and spectacle like no one else. The The makeup, the branding, the merchandise, it was all a perfectly designed machine. Simmons treated rock and roll like a business model, and that was exactly why he and Cooper clashed. Alice had built his empire too. But for him, rock was still about emotion, rebellion, and connection. For Gene, it was about power, legacy, and profit. Their public feud began when Gene Simmons declared that rock was dead. Not metaphorically, he meant it literally. He blamed streaming services, the collapse of record sales, and the lack of young talent. He said that modern musicians were lazy and uninspired, and that the golden era of rock had ended with his generation. To Cooper, those words felt like betrayal. Rock wasn't supposed to be measured by sales or charts. It was supposed to be about energy, about kids picking up cheap guitars in garages and dreaming of something bigger. He shot back in an interview, saying that Gene might be talking about rock's financial death, but spiritually, it was very much alive.
Been murdered, all right. Not by outside forces, foreign powers. We killed rock and roll.
He said he'd seen it himself as a judge on music competitions, young bands still learning from legends, still playing with fire in their hearts. That difference summed up the two men perfectly. Gene Simmons believed in the power of numbers. Alice Cooper believed in the power of passion. Where Gene saw decline, Alice saw evolution. He refused to accept that rock was dead, because to him, as long as there were kids strumming riffs in small rooms, rock and roll would never die. Through all these feuds and misunderstandings, one thing remained constant: Alice Cooper's undying love for rock itself. His grudges were rarely personal. They were about philosophy, about what the music stood for. Whether it was an outspoken peer like Dee Snider, a fallen brother like Dennis Dunaway, a manipulative mentor like Frank Zappa, a drunken brawl with Kasabian, it was the political idealism of John Lennon, or the cynicism of Gene Simmons. Cooper's anger always came from the same place, a fierce, almost protective love for the art that had saved his life. He hated what threatened to distort rock, but even in his hatred, there was passion. And that's what made him who he was, a man who could never truly hate the music, only the ways people tried to change it.